Welcome back to our discussion around long-term athletic development. So we got our LTAD. And this week we're back with talking about stage 2, right? This 10 to 12-year-old age. Last week we talked about the stage 1, looking at ages 6 to 9, and we talked a lot about the movement library. How many books can we get in the library? We talked about the idea of really trying to expand the ability for kids to learn how to move and to learn how to do a lot of different things, from jumping, climbing, running, to crawling, to rolling, to doing all these different things. We wanted to really expand their ability to get a lot of exposure to different movements. This week, we're talking about stage 2. We're talking about ages 10 to 12. And our main thing that we want to think about in this stage is skill development phase. I'm just going to put Devo phase. So our skill development phase. So that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So in this skill development phase, this is really where we're thinking that athletes are refining movement skills and learning how to train. And so there's a few things that we want to think about that are really happening at this stage. And of course they're happening throughout the stages, right? Like, these stages are just meant to kind of give us some guidelines, but we have to remember that the crossover between these stages is always happening. Like kids are always developing in certain ways as they grow. They're always developing neurologically. They're always developing movement skills. They're always developing stability and coordination and different things at different stages in different ways, right? So it's all a little bit fluid, right? But there are some things that we can think about as we're learning to develop our athletes. And so here we want to think about coordination, we want to think about skill learning, we want to think about training habits. Okay, so with coordination, we're getting the ability to control our bodies in space, right? Kids are starting to understand how to move appropriately, how to understand the skills that we're doing, and they're starting to get a grasp of where their bodies are at in space and learning how to control that, right? It's not perfect, but we're starting to get a grasp of that, and so we want to take advantage of that with honing in on good movement patterns. Skill learning, we're not just like, that kind of goes with this coordination piece, right? But we're starting to understand, and they are starting to understand. Even as you're teaching them with words, they're starting to be able to comprehend the things that you're talking about, how you want them to move, what it looks like, and they're starting to be able to digest some of this stuff in a little bit better way. And then training habits. Really, this is just important because not at this stage or this age, they're also starting to understand, like, what does it look like to work hard? What does it look like to be process-oriented, not performance-driven? What does it look like to be able to show up and show consistency? What does it look like to desire to develop in something and to grow into something and to have a vision for where they're headed, right? These kids are still really young, but they're also going to start understanding these things, right? And they're seeing the athletes that they follow doing the same thing, and so they want to begin to take in those footsteps, right? So it's an important age that we can lay the foundation of helpful training habits and not hurtful training habits, right? Not the idea that you need to grind and to work and never rest, right? We need to think about, how do we teach them about rest? How do we teach them about hard work? How do we teach the balance between those two things? How do we teach, like I said earlier, about being process oriented, right? Like, if more kids were instilled with this idea of being process driven and not performance driven, the youth sports and just kids' lives in general would change so much for the better, because we're so ingrained with driving towards, I have to be this, I have to be successful, I have to be the best, I have to be all these things. And when they don't get them, right, they crumble and fall apart because their identity is tied to that thing instead of their identity being tied to the person that they're becoming and the process they're driving towards. And so that is what we really want to emphasize. It's a really important piece. So in all of this, right, we can't just think about the physical developing that we're trying to push towards our athletes, but also the mental and spiritual development that we're encouraging them to pursue in the way that they approach sport. And so we talked about in the last stage, the word that we used, right, was movement library. in this stage, we want to think about now taking that library and adding literacy to it, right? So not just having a big library, right? Not just having a lot of access to different movements, but now starting to learn of the technique behind some of these movements, right? Early on, we're really thinking allowing the kids to have fun, to be in games, to let their bodies kind of explore, learn new movements, all that kind of stuff to keep this wide library. But now we want to think about also adding in some literacy with these movements, and so teaching them the skill of how to move. And so we have this stage of skill learning, and so it's going to be a really great window to teach technique, right? We're not worried about loading. We're not worried about really even thinking about volume and intensity. We're keeping those things at a minimum for the most part during this stage, but we want to just think repetitions, right? So volume is important, but in terms of like volume at high intensities, we're not really worried about that. We're worried about just continuing to get reps to drive motor patterns and to teach the athletes to be able to really nail these certain movements. And so a few key movements we can think about is squat, hinging, pushing, pulling, and then we'll call it carry. Right? So squat, hinge, push, pull, and carry. These are some basic motor patterns that we can really nail, right? We can hammer these things over and over and over with minimal weight at body weight, but teaching these kids how to begin to move their bodies, how to do it appropriately, how to do it, and begin to do some loading, right? But making sure that technique is the foundation of everything we're doing. And along with that, all the things that we talked about last week, right, they're still here, right? We're just thinking weight room technique right now. So you could think almost like we have this section here is our weight room technique. And then over here, I would say that the same thing that goes with our weight room technique would be also our sprints, agility. Before agility, we'd say COD, change of direction, crawling, and then maybe just call it gymnastics along with that. And so over here, we're still thinking that we want to make sure we're getting those wide ranges of motion, the different stimuluses. We want to be sprinting a lot. We want to be doing a lot of change of direction work. But with all these things, now we can, instead of just playing games, we still want to play games, but we can also have moments of being able to teach this technique and begin to think about how are we moving, how are we doing it appropriately, are we able to start learning some of the developmental things that come with having high efficiency in these skills. But the key is that as we teach these skills, right, we can teach technique, but we can still make sure it's fun, right? We can still make sure we're bringing joy into training and really talking about how we can do these things and still have fun in the environment that we're creating by teaching good training habits, okay? And so thinking about building technique in this stage is really important. And so we want to make sure that we're driving this home, but at the same time, we want to make sure we're having fun. And so even thinking about how you're developing your sessions or building out your sessions, right, is not the whole entire session should be about technique, or not the entire session should be, just about learning how to squat or just learning about hinge. But we want to think about microdosing, right? So this is a really important thing that you're going to see in most quality programs. A lot of things should be microdosed, right? We don't want to think about, hey, I'm getting an hour straight of squat learning, and then the next day we're going to do an hour straight of hinge squatting. Or, one day we're only doing sprints and that's all we're doing. But more thinking in the grand scheme of things, how can I slowly layer in all these different things on a day by day, on a week by week, on a month by month basis, where, we're not spending an hour. Maybe it's only 10 minutes a day or 5 minutes a day on some of these movement patterns, right? But if I'm continually teaching these things, and I'm not just thinking about how to teach them, but I'm thinking about how to slowly progress them appropriately over a long period of time, right? Really thinking in this stage with technique over this entire 2-year span. If I'm thinking about how can I put small micro doses in on a weekly basis of teaching all of these things and making sure we are covering all of these things, right? We're not just worried about squatting and hinging and pushing and pulling and carrying, right? Those are a big piece, but I can't just live here, in my development, right? But I also can't just live here either. We want to be able to encompass all of it, but sometimes it can get overwhelming in how we're doing that because we're like, man, there's so many things. And so being able to break it up into bite-sized pieces so kids can learn better, because they're going to learn better that way too if they can just have a little bit of new information each day. A little bit of new information each day, right? Not getting the entire book thrown at them in one session and saying, all right, learn this, and then not really revisiting it for another 3 months, because then they're not going to learn that way, right? So thinking about how can we structure it to where we're getting consistent exposures to all of these different types of training is going to be really important as we develop over this 2-year span. All right, so we also want to talk about some things to avoid. And one of the things that I really think is important in this stage to really make sure so skill is greater than intensity. And so in this stage specifically, this is a really easy window, right? Early on in kind of the first stage of ages 6 to 9, I would say it's a little more challenging. You still definitely see it, to see parents kind of throwing too much weight on the bar or throwing too much intensity on kids in that window. But I would say in this window, it's actually pretty common that you can start to see the kids show this desire to learn how to lift, and they show a desire to want to be in the weight room and want to get better and want to practice and want to go play. And the parents don't have the understanding of what it might look like to slowly progress into our intensity and learning a skill first, learning the foundations first, and then slowly layering in volume and intensity as they grow and as they develop in an appropriate way. But sometimes the parents don't have that understanding, which is, it's not their fault, right? But this is why I'm teaching these things, is because if we can have this sort of education for all parents, then we can recognize that in this window, when my kids are like, oh, I saw this high school kid doing this, or I saw this kid doing this, and the parents want the best for their kids, but they don't really know what the best is, and so they just say, sure, we can jump into this high intensity program, and maybe they, pass them over to some coaches who don't have the best interest of their kids at heart or don't really know quality training. And so we start pumping intensity, right, through poor technique squatting and hinging, and we're trying to lift heavy weights and all these different things, or we're trying to play a ridiculous amount of games and we're throwing as hard as we possibly can every time we throw, and we're on the mound 3 times a week. And what ends up happening, right, is we end up seeing a lot of kids in this window begin to start to see injuries, right, in a phase of life when they shouldn't be getting hurt, right? Like, of course, like, life happens and kids will get hurt. But I think the amount of injuries that are happening are because we're jumping in to so much intensity, because our kids get this stage at 10 to 12 in that range, and they get a passion for sport. They start to really say, like, man, I really want to be good at this. I want to play at the next level. I want to do this. And so their parents are like, well, I want you to achieve all your dreams. And so they throw them into all these different programs without really understanding what the type of training they should be working in and what types of things they should be doing, and really focusing on the skill first before we get into the intensity, right? Learning the patterns and the techniques of things first, at least in the weight room, before we add intensity, right? Learning these things and taking a long-term athletic development approach, right? That's the whole point of what this means, is I want my kids to be developing in the appropriate way for a long time, right? And so if we jump into intensity, right, we're skipping a lot of steps. And in skipping those steps, we're leading and increasing the risk for our kids to get hurt and to ultimately have a career full of injuries and a career full of frustrations and struggle because the foundation wasn't laid appropriately. And so my encouragement in this stage is really fight to not jump into intensity quickly, right? And if you see a coach who is taking kids and the first thing they're doing is high intensity exercises, right, or you see them loading a bar super heavy before they've really learned quality technique, then run away quickly, right? We want to protect our kids, we want to protect our youth athletes, and we want to make sure that we can allow them to develop for a really long time. And so big takeaways for this stage is technique, right? This is going to be a really huge developmental phase for young athletes to learn quality technique and to really set them up for success, right? The amount of kids working in a Division I weight room, it blew my mind, the amount of kids that would come in and they're the best in their sport, but then you put them in the weight room and they have no idea how to move. They don't know how to squat. They don't know how to hinge. They don't know how to do single leg squats. They don't know how to do a push-up well. They don't know how to do any of this stuff well, right? But they're still freaky strong. But the idea is if we can think about how much further down the road some of these kids would have been, and especially think about, I'm thinking of kids who were dealing with nagging injuries and different things like that, and thinking about how much better they would have been if they had this type of development when they were young kids and they weren't pushed more to the side of just playing a lot of games in their sport, right? And so we really want to take advantage of this window. We want to take advantage of this being a window when our kids are learning a lot of coordination, when they're really good at skill learning, and when they're building these philosophies in their mind of how to train. We want to take advantage of that and really think about how we can make sure we're building skill over intensity to set our kids up for success. And so if this video has helped you, please like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. We're going to keep putting out information like this. The goal that we have at 48 Performance, the goal that I have is that I want to help educate. I'm learning how to do all this stuff, and so hopefully the videos are going to get better over time. But ultimately, my goal is to educate parents and coaches on what does it look like for our kids to develop well from a young age all the way up through the highest levels of sport. And so I hope this video helped you guys out, and we'll see you on the next one.